If I could get everybody's attention. What do they say at the U.S. Open? Please, please. They expect everybody to know what that means. It means quiet. Thank you. Please. Thank you for coming. I see from the beautiful weather outside that once again I will have no excuse for my poor golf after this, which is in some ways unfortunate. I'll find some other excuse. It's okay. We are going to have three presenters this morning, but before I introduce them, a little housekeeping. For those of you who are lawyers and need continuing legal education credits, you can sign up here either before you leave. It's very simple, and you can get a credit. So every credit helps. And we will have a legal component as well as the market components of our presentations this morning. The presentations first and foremost is going to be Sia Kusha. Sia is the head of Plenary's business development and partnering group. Plenary is the worldwide leader in P3 development and as a concessionaire, and their work spreads across multiple different sub-industries. So Sia is literally, if not one of the leading experts in marketing, knowing the market for P3 across the world. But he's going to, I think, focus more on the United States market update today. And then after Sia's done, we're going to have Matt Murray come up, and Matt Murray is with Rutan, in our construction and P3 group. Matt's going to talk about design-build as opposed to just P3 in terms of the market update for that. And then Steve Barbieri from Rutan will get up and talk about the legal developments over the last year in construction law, focused on California. We've had a few very important legal developments this past year. We just want to keep everybody up to speed. And for those attorneys like me in the group, that helps us get our CLE. So thank you, Steve. My name is Bill Eliopoulos. I'm the co-chair of Rutan's construction and P3 group. Also hosting this morning is John Antrocoli. When Sia's done, John is going to introduce Matt and Steve. The all important for golf, as in the past, as soon as we're done today, head over to the golf course. We will be done by 9 o'clock here, and then head over to the golf course, where the driving range, I think, is. And our first tee times are at 9:50, and then every 10 minutes after that. The caddies, as usual, have been pre-tipped, so don't worry about tipping the caddies. They're fully pre-tipped. And even if they're good, they're fully pre-tipped. We assume they're good. All right. And with that, I'd like to introduce Sia Kusha. After Sia's done, there'll be like a short period for questions and answers.
Thanks, Bill, and good morning, everyone. As Bill mentioned, my name is Sia Kusha. I run Plenary's project development, business development across the Americas. The guy he talked to, I don't know who he is. I'm just an old highway engineer that gave up engineering about 5 years ago and decided to play in the private equity market. Background, civil engineer. I've been in this business 42 years. The past 22 years predominantly in the P3s and integrated delivery. And as Bill mentioned, my predecessor, Mike Marasco, came after me hard when I was running AECOM's integrated delivery team and said, why don't you come on and work with us? You get to play at Pebble Beach. You get to meet people like Bill and his team. And I thought, okay, you had me at Pebble Beach. I'm in. So thanks again for inviting me, Bill. This has been a great opportunity, not only for us to communicate with the industry, but also it gives me an impetus to go back and take a look in the year that has passed, because we are getting ready to do our planning process for next fiscal. And it's always good to go back and take stock of what has happened in the marketplace. Just a little ad for who we are and what we do. As Bill mentioned, we are I don't know about globally, but North America's America's largest and most active P3 developer. And to us, P3s are performance-based, long-term risk-balanced and risk transfer contracts with a creditworthy counterparty, predominantly in the public infrastructure market. We are asset agnostic, which basically means as long as we can deploy capital in a long-term basis, we will invest in projects. So we work both in the civil infrastructure as well as social infrastructure. Our civil infrastructure is predominantly transport, although as of late we have started to work, and we are the only concessionaire in the Americas who works on a broadband basis. So we design, build, operate, finance, maintain, and commercialize broadband infrastructure. There are 2 contracts in North America that are both active, and they're both ours. One is with Pennsylvania Turnpike, and one is with North Carolina Department of Transportation. We're actively engaged in probably half a dozen other mandates in that sector. We are looking at this whole entire EV charging and EV infrastructure, the smart city application. We recently won and closed the District of Columbia's street lighting infrastructure upgrade. That gives us effectively 2 years to change over 35,000 lights, light poles, mastheads, and make every one of them a smart city pole across the district, providing for the underlying grid that in the future will be the basis for free internet across the district. We've got some other unique things in our portfolio. We invested in and now currently are managing, we did the design-build finance, and now we're operating and maintaining Canada's equivalent to our NSA. It's called CSAC. We run Government of Canada's greatest national archives. All the things, paperwork that goes back to the founding of Canada is under our management. And then we started by investing in the healthcare market, in hospitals. We have 13 hospitals, by far the largest investor and operator of hospitals in the Canadian market. We've done what you see on the screen: Long Beach, the Civic Center and the Port Authority buildings, the library, the park, and we are now finalizing the redevelopment of the old tower. If you remember what the City Hall used to look like in Long Beach, we are redeveloping that into predominantly workforce housing and mixed-use development. We're not a private developer, in the sense that private developers creating markets and creating opportunities within the mixed-use environment in the vertical space. We don't mind hybrid projects that actually have a little bit of real estate risk in them or a little bit of mixed use, but we need the projects to be predominantly public infrastructure. And as such, most of the things I'm going to talk about this morning are in that realm. So what happened? P3s started back in 2012 in the Americas, and if you take a look across the chart that you see, we had pretty solid progression across a variety of different sectors between 2000 and right after the global financial crisis, about 2011, 2010 timeframe. So what you see here are closed transactions. So if a transaction closes in 2012, you can just about guarantee that it started the procurement process in a 2008, 2009 timeframe. P3s traditionally take a long time to develop. They're not for every project. We specifically offer our advice, our guidance to the owners that if you think a project could be done traditional way or CM type project or a bid build project, go that route if you know what you want and if you have all the specs taken care of. But if on the other hand you're looking to transfer risk and effectively getting yourself a 30-year guarantee on the asset, both in terms of initial design and construction, but also in operations and maintenance, then a P3 may be something that you should consider. P3s are expensive to develop. There are a series of internal and external advisors and consultancies that have to come to market from the owner side as well as from the proponent side. So typically, when you look at not only in here, you see both in terms of volume and in terms of value of the projects. A typical P3, in order for it as a one-off project to pencil out, needs to be around pre-current and pre-recent inflationary pressures, about 75 million to 100 million for a single asset would pencil out. Now, given the changes in the marketplace, both in terms of supply chain disruptions, in terms of inflations on labor and other costs, we're probably looking at about 150 to 175 million dollars worth a single capex project in order for it to pencil out. But these numbers, again, if you take a look at all the way up through 2021, it's where projects were about 75 to 100 million dollars as a bottom, as a kind of a floor threshold. So great progression, great number of projects in across everywhere. There was a bit in 2020 that was made up in 2021. Then the pandemic hit, and if you take a look at what happened in terms of number of projects that closed in 2022, which was the depth of the pandemic, it was pretty much about half, or a regression back to roughly 2017, pre-2018 timeframe. The greatest reason for that were twofold. Because of the pandemic, the majority of the public sector owners, who are the counterparties to large PPPs, were completely and totally unsure of what would happen to their revenue streams. Caltrain, for example, just up the road here, they almost went bankrupt. So between Caltrain and Samtrans, they had no income. And although a fair amount of the public sector owners rely on federal, state, and local funding and subsidies, there was no revenue stream. New York Metro lost over 80% of their annual revenues from the fare box. So everything went into hiatus. All the airport sector projects, absolute shutdown. JFK had 3 projects active in a P3 procurement environment at the terminals. They all went dormant, and they were just recently brought back up. And I think one of the 3 just financially closed not too long ago. So if you take a look at this, the P3 market, just because of the pandemic and because of the impact of the pandemic on public sector revenues, took a significant hit. Coming out of and let me show you what it looks like in terms of volume and between U.S. and Canada. Now, if you remember, about 10 years ago, Canada was the hot market for P3s. Anything over $50 million Canadian in Canada would have to go through a value for money analysis or a public sector comparator to see whether or not they could do it as a P3. And almost every project over $50 million in CapEx in Canada, both vertical and horizontal, were done as a P3. Some were revenue risk, some were availability payments. The availability payments are basically like a lease-back deal, but the government guarantees you a certain amount of dollars on an annual basis as long as you meet their performance KPI of a building. In a hospital, it could be anything from availability of ORs and oxygens in patient rooms. In a research facility, it could be the temperature and humidity, various different things. But if you go back and take a look, you can actually see that has flipped, both in terms of volume and in terms of dollars. If you take a look at as of August, this is data through August 30th of 2022, so it's probably a week 10 days old. Canada has significantly curtailed the PPP gain, whereas in the U.S. we continue to see it. A couple of reasons for that in Canada. In Canada, they have what they call the NDP, which is the New Democrats, mostly a socialist, very liberal, left-leaning party. You have the Greens, which are to the left of those guys, and then you have the Tories, or the Conservatives, which are to the right of that. The Tories or the Conservatives across Canada at the federal level as well as the provincial level are a lot more pro-private sector, whereas both the NDP and the Greens are very anti-private sector, and the entire base of the party members and all of the activities are pro-labor unions. As you can imagine, when you talk about a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, the operations and maintenance of an asset over a 30 to 50 year period is something that the unions in Canada believe it's their God-given right and nobody else should touch it. I don't care if it's a hospital, if it's a courthouse, if it's a university, a transit project, or whatever you can imagine. And as a result of that, every time NDP comes to power, which in Canada is cyclical, about 2 or 3 elections in a row, both at the provincial level and the federal level, Tories win, and then that changes, and NDP or the Greens will come in. In that environment, currently now, if you look at British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Quebec, they're all NDP-type provincially governed. And as a result of that, British Columbia, where was the hottest market for P3s, hasn't had a P3 in 6 years. Alberta is just beginning to get back into that space, and so on and so forth. And again, the reason I suggest that, or we mention that, is simply the fact that a lot of the Canadian contractors with whom most of you folks in the construction business here may have never heard of previously are in the U.S. and are actively engaging to expand their services. If you remember, none of my colleagues from PCL are in the room, but if you remember, PCL had a huge operation in the U.S., both in the civil and buildings. PCL just about shut down their civil program in the U.S. because they were so busy in Canada, and obviously being from Canada, they were always big in Canada. And as the market was going quite strong, they decided not to participate in the U.S. civil market. Well, now they're coming back. Now they're actually reorganized and they're doing a lot more. Other Canadian contractors are spending more and more time in the U.S. Elliston, which is PCL's largest competitor, has appointed leadership for the U.S. and they're actively engaged in marketing and business development and are talking to different folks, both in terms of opportunity for joint ventures as well as potential purchases and acquisitions of U.S. contractors. So we see this cross-border dynamic or the tension that when Canada is doing a lot of P3s, most of the predominant Canadian contractors stay up north and the U.S. contractors go about their business. But as the market continues to be robust in the U.S., we see competition from the Canadian contractors that, again, it's not limited to P3s. They do this pretty routinely. In terms of where we rank on a global basis in terms of overall P3s and where we think the future transaction volumes are going to look like. If you take a look at UK and US, pretty much neck and neck. And so when you think about the total size of the market in the US, in terms of geography, in terms of number of different public sector owners that do these types of projects, and you take a look at the volume in terms of the total number of deals, and the fact that US and England or UK are pretty much on par, it's an amazing comparison. And the reason for it is quite simple. In England, the concept of a public-private partnership and delivering assets through a long-term life cycle asset perspective has taken hold. So the government in the UK does not do any other type of contracting, even on smaller projects, and they've been able to figure out the magic, if you will, to apply P3s to projects that have a smaller value. And for that reason, you see that comparison. Now, if you go down to the rest of them, Canada doesn't even fit in the top 10 or 12, which is amazing because in North America, Canada was the hotbed, and almost every analysis you want to look at in North America with respect to why P3s are effective happened in Canada, and we reference those guys a lot. But in terms of future transactions, we really don't see that changing unless there's significant change within the provincial governments. Transaction by geography, again, US about roughly 88 to 90 future transactions that we see coming over the next 24 months. These are substantial projects. And again, these are projects like, for example, the Hudson Tunnel, the Amtrak Tunnel in New York, the Union Station in Washington, D.C. These are large-scale programs that are in the billions of dollars. And then when you compare those to Canada, Canada's got 9 of them in there. But of those 9, 3 are hospitals. that are $3 billion apiece. And what's interesting in Canada, because the Canadian contractors no longer want to pursue P3s as a fixed price option, which is one of the reasons why in the US there's a bit of a pushback on P3s. The Canadian government at the provincial and at the federal level are literally doing everything they can to recruit US contractors. There are a lot of big name US contractors in the vertical space that are seriously considering kind of an entree into Canada. Walsh has been there. They're thinking of going back. Kiewit's always been there. They're looking to expand their social infrastructure footprint. Suffolk is looking at it pretty hard. Gilbane is looking at it pretty hard. And as a matter of fact, they have a strategic planning process coming up here within the next several months. And they're seriously looking at significant investment to start looking at Canada as an opportunity. Transactions by sector in terms of what we see in the marketplace. One of the really interesting things is that when you look across the market, the top 3 sectors in the marketplace did not exist in the P3 space 2 years ago. Energy, renewables, and power. These are everything from generation to distribution to carbon capture to net zero. And a fair amount of this has also been fueled by IIJA, and I'll talk about that in a second. So if you take a look at the total volume, the top 3 combined are more than twice of the rest of the space added together. Surface transport or transportation, which is airports, aviation, ports and marine, rail transit, and road and bridge. Those, based on what's available today in the marketplace, we see about 10 transactions coming to market over the next 2 years. Social infrastructure, that's a 6. Those are major projects. What's interesting about social infrastructure is, and we talked about this a little bit last night at dinner, under the new IIJA, the federal government is providing mechanisms for direct appropriations to local municipalities from the feds directly to the cities and counties to do social infrastructure projects that would be eligible for things like TIFIA, private activity bonds, PABs, and other mechanisms that the federal government allows them to do. In addition, through what the concept known as infra labs, the federal government allows these smaller municipalities that don't have the wherewithal or the financial capacity or have never done it before, access to advisors pretty much for free or through grant funding. And we'll manage that in a second. So what we see, even though today in the marketplace there's only a handful of social infrastructure projects, but we are beginning to see, and we are having incoming mandates and inquiries from public sector owners that are looking to do P3s on a wide variety of social infrastructure projects. K through 12 is going to be huge. The first K through 12 P3 in the U.S. financially closed about a year ago in Prince George's County, Maryland, at about $600 and $800 million. Phase 2 of that same program at $1.3 billion will start procurement this fall. Nevada and the county around Vegas has a deferred maintenance backlog of over $6 billion in their K through 12 schools. That is going to come to market. And again, because of the direct infusion of cash from the federal government, a lot of projects that didn't even exist a year ago are now actively being talked about. Not every one of them is going to be a P3, and I think that's why the design-build and a CMAR market is also going to benefit from this, from the direct infusion of cash. But we see social infrastructure taking a huge leap and be on par with the energy sector in terms of numbers of projects that are there. So I said K through 12 is huge. Courthouses are huge. Civic facilities, even small communities like North Miami are looking to replace their city hall, their parking structures, the police station, fire station, all within a certain contained campus. What's interesting is that most cities and counties in the U.S. are land-rich and cash-poor. They have a series of underutilized or dilapidated assets. that don't necessarily meet the requirements of an efficient workflow processes today. So City of North Miami, just to give you an example, has 14 or 15 different parcels of land. Some are surface parking lots, some are old buildings that have been knocked down, and some are buildings that are simply being used as storage. So they're out in the marketplace today. You're trying to monetize those assets through a real estate deal, take that money and provide the subsidy and a base funding for a combined police station, city hall, and a museum in a single campus. The total value of that deal, all said and done, could be about $100 to $150 million. So again, on the lower threshold of P3s in terms of viability, but we are seeing projects like that come to market more and more under two scenarios. Predominantly lease-back structures that allow them, the public sector owner, to get out of the sector quicker, but they also, there are some that are substantial enough that would be used to go through a P3 environment. Let's see, telecom, most of those have always been private, that will continue to be private. There are some major players in there that are trying to expand that environment. But again, I mean, the top three are huge. So some general trends. Last year when I did this virtually, we talked about, you know, the industry's hope to get an infrastructure bill package signed. We have that. We have the bill signed, implemented, and monies are now actually flowing. $110 billion for roads and bridges, $73 billion for power grid, $60 billion for Amtrak, $65 billion for broadband expansion, and that's everything and anything from fiber to home, all the way to long haul and data center applications and so on and so forth. Now, every one of these sectors, if you look at it, at the heart of the sector itself is building the underlying infrastructure. And the infrastructure, quite frankly, does not exist. I mean, in terms of the power industry, the power grid. You guys all live in California. I'm the only one from Florida. So this whole business about the PG&E and the power grid. And now there's the concept that by 2035, I think it is, or 2030, no more gasoline-powered vehicles to be sold in California. But then PG&E says don't plug your cars in when you get home from work. Right? So something's got to give, right? And where that give comes in is quite frankly the infrastructure build. And you see the numbers. I don't necessarily need to read through that. $55 billion for clean water. I think City of Jackson, Mississippi finally turned the taps back on yesterday or the day before, after 2 weeks of not having any water. Huge water main break in City of Austin yesterday that affected the power grid that basically shut down the airport for 10 hours. So the infrastructure in this country is significantly older and way beyond its useful life. And so you can see the kind of monies that are being spent on infrastructure. Above and beyond dollars, what's interesting about the IIJA at the federal level, it increases the private activity bonds to $30 billion. Private activity bonds were capped at $15 billion. They were predominantly for large-scale, heavy civil projects. Now they've added, basically they've doubled that capacity, and they have lowered the threshold of what projects are eligible for it. We were talking about TODs last night at dinner. Transit-oriented development, effectively creating mixed-use towers in and around transit stations, are now eligible for federal funding, federal grants, and very cheap monies through TIFIA. 2-3 years ago, that didn't exist. So we see a significant boom in the vertical construction marketplace in and around transit lines, where new transit stations are being built or transit stations are being modified as a part of that $40 billion worth of federal dollars that are going in. New York MTA has a $6 billion program just to address the ADA requirement of their stations. Over half of the stations in the 5 boroughs of New York do not accommodate wheelchairs or do not accommodate handicap access. So if you're in a wheelchair, you cannot get on and get off the station you want. You have to get off station before or station after and go to a couple of blocks via surface streets. There's 3-4 packages out currently under construction. We are competing in one as about $1 billion multi-station renovation as a P3. And all indications are if the P3 works and MTA can transfer the risk of operations and maintenance of the elevators and escalators and the stations over to the private sector, they would do that as a cost savings measure. So we see a fair amount of that coming in. And again, the opportunity to apply for private activity bonds and grants and very cheap loans, I think TIFIA is at 2.5%, and they will pay all the application costs. USDOT does. Now, the thought of going to USDOT and applying for cheap money to build a high-rise tower is so new, and there will be legal implications and who's going to get into the marketplace and so on and so forth. So 2-3 years from now, we'll see whether or not these $30 billion additional capacity was well spent or well invested. I talked about InfraLabs. InfraLabs basically allows USDOT to provide almost free advisory services to public sector owners to get ready for P3s. And these are financial, legal, and procurement advisors. Big names like KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young, technical advisors like HNTBA, Ecom, HDR, WSP, and legal advisories are all eligible to participate in this program. And what you do is, as an advisor, you sign up with USDOT, Build America Bureau, or Build America Center as they call it now. And then when a local entity comes along that says, I need help to develop and deliver a P3, they will provide that local entity the opportunity to come talk to these advisors. Asset recycling and advisory grants, that's huge. The entire P3 market in Australia happened on asset recycling. So basically, the government of Australia told the local provinces, if you will, the local areas, that, hey, if you want to go ahead and spend time developing P3s, monetize the assets you have, and we will pay you more than what they're worth, and so on and so forth. So that's not available. I've talked about TIFIA and RIF loans and airport authorization for those projects. The fast forward on permitting, that's a really streamlining of the permitting process in the environmental sector. WIFIA for water infrastructure was reauthorized significantly, and broadbands are now again eligible for the federal dollars and federal funding that we hadn't seen before. Couple of quick items in terms of some of the other trends. It actually, in addition to all the other funding mechanisms that have been put in place, the bill allows for folks to kind of mix and match. If you remember, during the pandemic, there was a whole bunch of dollars being sent to the local jurisdictions. A fair amount of those dollars have not been spent yet, but the bill allows for a local municipality or a county or a state to take some of those dollars, mix them with the IIJA, and use those combined dollars. There's significant concern at the local levels that if, in fact, the House changes its leadership in November, there may be some possible movement by the new House leadership to claw back some of the unspent monies in order to help balance the budget, in order to show reduction in spending, and so on and so forth. So as a result of that concern for the clawback, we're seeing a significant number of projects coming to market that are really not ready for prime time. And what that does, we think that it has the potential for becoming a bit of a problem for procurement agencies and for owners and ultimately for contractors who are out there building these things. In terms of market risks, the market is still concerned about risks with respect to procurement, with respect to delivery and long-term O&M. most of the contractors that we work with and are engaged with even today are having a hard time giving guaranteed on prices beyond 30 days, sometimes even. And in a P3 environment and in a hard bid design build type procurement, they need to be able to guarantee your prices for 6, 8, 10, 12 months is next to impossible in today's market. So there's a bit of an apprehension there. There's always concerns about delivery. The whole promise of P3s, when it was first introduced in North America, was the fact that because you have a developer-led process and the developer actively manages design construction phase of the project, you would not see change orders. You'd be able to manage that process a lot better. Then, quite frankly, through some misguided advisory decisions and so on and so forth, people were taking and copying and pasting the procurement specs from one project and applying it to the other project, and as a result, there were some projects that really didn't do all that well. So there were delivery concerns, both in terms of contractual obligations as well as activities on the field, that kind of had some P3 developers and as well as contractors pull back from the marketplace. That's still there. Long-term O&M concerns are still there. There is still that tug-of-war, that dynamic tension between the public sector operators unions versus the private sector folks that run these projects. We don't see that going away, but I think as the market continues to mature, we'll probably see opportunity for those conversations to get better. Talked about market resistance with respect to people not wanting to bid hard bid prices anymore or fixed prices. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard about the Travelers report that came out in terms of the profitability of different types of programs and projects. The more that report is out in the industry, the more it actually shows that profitability of contractors really isn't related to the model of procurement. Rather, it's more related to the optimism of the contractors, thinking that if I can do a $500 million project, say with a 15-point margin and contingency, I can apply the same thing, the same processes to a $1 billion project and get away with it. And that has proven not to be the case. So a lot of significant contractors, Granite, Skanska, Balfour, a whole bunch of these folks are backing away from the industry, from P3s and fixed price, even design build contracts, and are looking for collaborative models. The collaborative models, it's really the progressives, as you're hearing about them, are the rage today, and I'm not going to read through these, but they can, they really run the gamut in terms of what exactly is done. Some progressive models are very much aligned with the CM type approach. Some progressive models, the owners look to the developers and design builders to bring a full team together. Some, the interim agreement periods are are shorter, some are much longer. The Sepulveda Pass that LA Metro is doing, the interim agreement period is not only 2 years long, but it's with 2 different contracting teams. So it's a collaborative model running in parallel in competition to keep the dynamic tension in place, and at the end of that time frame, LA Metro will ultimately choose one solution to move forward. Some of the considerations for the public sector in terms of what a collaborative model should do and should cover. And again, I don't necessarily need to read through all of these, but the biggest thing is the fact that it allows the public sector to procure a team that they like on qualifications and some quantitative measures, and then sit across the table in an open, transparent process. Again, similar to a CM, but a CM with significant risk transfer and equity investment on behalf of the developer to cash flow the process all the way through the execution of the comprehensive agreement, move the process forward. A couple other comments with respect to how the collaborative model could work for the private sector. Most of the audience here today. It actually helps us on our side of the table reduce our overall costs. It allows, because the owner is at the table, there's cost sharing, and even though we will cash flow the process, or the contractor cash flows the process during the interim agreement period, ultimately our costs are lower because we get coverage. We may have to kind of finance that over the period. Significant discussion. We've always talked about partnering. We've talked about collaborative engagements and so on and so forth. This actually forces people to sit across the table, because most often the owners come to the table with concepts and not even DDs. They come in with some stacking thoughts and ideas, and we get to work with them and trying to move things around and help them out. And then a fair amount of the conversation is on risk. Who's in the best place to position, the best position to handle it and manage it, as opposed to who's in the best place to bid it the cheapest, which quite frankly is what was happening in the marketplace. And last but not least, it really brings a significant focus into the overall process. Here's a timeline for what a collaborative model could look like. We see this as a part of a lot of the current contracts coming to market. What the public sector needs to do, what the private sector needs to do, and what the overall timeline looks like, and how the permitting and environment, and the processes work together. And based on what we have seen under this process, you can probably cut anywhere between 12 to 18 months out of the overall development process, and from our side of the table. And the owners save a significant amount of money not having to pay their consultants to go ahead and develop a whole bunch of preliminaries and then stamp it, don't rely on these when you make your bids. So the amount of monies that are being spent by both sides in the development period actually go towards a workable product that could be relied upon for bid and future construction. I've ran out of over my time, but I thought it would be worth having the conversation. I'm more than happy to answer any questions if you have it. Otherwise, I'm going to have John come up and get us through the next one. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Antrockley. I'm a partner in Rutan Tucker's construction and infrastructure group. I'm also the managing partner of Rutan Tucker's Northern California offices. I'll make this quick. We started this symposium 14 years ago. It says this is the 11th, but that's because we missed 2 years due to COVID. And we did so because we thought the future of sophisticated construction projects was in the design-build arena. P3 is part of that, and I think it's proven true that more and more projects are in the design-build area and create their own individual set of risks. Matt Murray is an associate in our Northern California offices. He does quite a bit of transactional work associated with design-build contracts, because we're getting a lot more of that type of work. And Matt's going to give us an update on what the design-build industry looks like today. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a brief overview of the construction market in general. This is non-residential construction in the U.S. over the last 10 years, and we have consistent growth over that period. This is, I don't know if you can see the numbers measured in billions, with a minor exception in 2017, and then we see a more pronounced decline in 2021. But if you look at the 7-month period, January to this last July, and compare that to last year, we see increases again, not quite to the level of 2020, but certainly on track for continued growth, with COVID being the aberration throwing this off. So despite general economic declines in the market, the non-residential construction and design-build in particular have proven to be fairly resilient, which is why projections remain optimistic at this point. And a recent AIA meta-analysis put together that summarizes, I think it's about 9 or 10 different sources. These are consensus values between those analyses. Those show 9.1 and 6% gains in 2022 and 2023. These are across these sectors in particular, being key sectors that they looked at. So looking at design build specifically, this is part of a DBIA FMI study that was done that updated their 2018 analysis. They're projecting a compound annual growth rate of 7.6% over 2021 to 2025. So some of the reasons for growth in the design build space, which Sia already touched on quite a bit, I'll just mention these. Owner positive experience with design build construction, much greater adoption of it by both contractors and owners. There's increasing familiarity with it in general. And as part of this study, FMI did a survey of a couple hundred stakeholders in the design build space, both owners and contractors, and found that as compared to 2018, there were increasing levels of satisfaction with design build construction delivery methods, with over 75% of survey respondents responding that they had a very good or excellent experience with design build construction. Sia briefly mentioned towards the end progressive design build construction, which has had the greatest adoption in the West Coast market, which compared to any other market, I think the next highest was 21%, maybe 22. So 40% is a pretty significant adoption rate for progressive design build compared to others. So that's coupled with enabling statutes, which I'll mention towards the end, that authorize greater utilization of design build by the public sector. That's why we're seeing more of this, and specific when it comes to progressive design build. So comparing the 2016 to 2020 timeframe and the projected 2021 to 2025 projection, we have a 5% increase in design build construction. But what I found interesting about this is we have a substantial decrease in the traditional design bid build method, down all the way to 15% by 2025. Looking at the top sectors, this is by projected annual growth, not the market share, but we have wastewater and water, communication and transportation, and then the top regions that are expected to dominate the design build market for construction put in place in the next 5 years: South Atlantic, West, South Central, being Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and again, the Pacific region. Okay, and then I will just summarize a couple of the enabling statutes regarding procurement in the public sector in California. We have AB 137, which authorizes the Department of General Services to use progressive design build procurement for up to 3 projects. So they're essentially testing the waters there with by authorizing that method based on analysis of prior successes in the private sector and by other government agencies. And then AB 1499 extends the DOT's authorization to use design-build procurement for up to 10 projects over the next 10 years, starting in 2024. And then SB 626, which authorizes the Department of Water Resources to use the CMGC or design-build procurement method for up to 7 projects each over the next 10 years, starting in 2023. So I'm going to keep it brief. There's a couple more things I can talk about, but I think I'm going to hand it off to Steve at this point, unless there are any questions. Okay, thank you very much.
I'll make this quick. Steve is a more recent addition to our construction practice. We're really excited about his future at the firm. He's done really good work over the last year or so he's been here, and recently he's managed to grow a really bad mustache.
Thanks, John. Time flies when you're having fun, John, because I've been here for 2 years now. Yes. And I promise to keep it short, like it's a podcast on 1.5 speed. So I'm going to go over a couple construction law updates, and first we'll talk about licensing. And an important case just came out in May this year from the 6th District Court of Appeal in California. So if there's projects in Santa Clara County, Santa Cruz, Monterey, San Benito, this case deals with whether or not a licensed general contractor can receive compensation for hiring an unlicensed sub. There are some possible ramifications that I'll discuss later, but the facts are pretty simple. A residential property owner purchased property in Los Gatos, attempted to redevelop the project for $1.6 million, executed a written prime contract with the GC. GC needed tree removal services, hired an unlicensed sub. It's arguable whether or not the unlicensed sub, the GC knew whether or not the sub was unlicensed. Unlicensed sub goes to do the work, removes the tree, noisy neighbor gets frustrated and calls the police. Police get involved, project owner shuts down the project, thereafter terminates their agreement due to lack of financing for the project. Owner had paid about 2/3 of the project sum to the tree removal service. Litigation ensues. There are cross complaints for breach of contract and express indemnity. At the trial court level, one of the main issues that we'll talk about today is whether or not the unlicensed sub could, or excuse me, the licensed GC could receive money for the unlicensed sub. The trial court level in Santa Clara County said no, that the licensed sub could not receive compensation, and so therefore the owner could disgorge profits from the general contractor. This went up to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal affirmed that decision. And some of the language the Court of Appeal used, when a license is required to perform certain work, California licensing law requirements under 7031 bars a licensed contractor from seeking compensation. Possible ramifications, I've talked to John and Bill about this. Given the interpretation that the Court of Appeal had on this case, 7031 may not actually say what the Court of Appeals had said. However, it's currently published law, and so possible ramifications are proceed at your own risk with unlicensed subcontractors. Next up in the licensing space is, in addition to Business and Professions Code 7068 and 7068.1, more commonly known to you all as the responsible managing employee. RMEs effective September 28th, 2021 is now codified in statute rather than in case law and in California regulations, is an individual who's a bona fide employee, meaning that they're permanently employed by the entity, and that they're actively engaged in the classification of work for the qualifying individual. Actively engaged is specifically defined to mean working at least 32 hours per week or 80% of the total hours of work for the applicant, whichever is less. Also, the statute defines what the RME must do, and they must exercise supervision and control, which is specifically defined to mean direct supervision and control, which is subdefined as supervising construction, managing construction activities by making technical and administrative decisions, checking jobs for proper workmanship, and supervising construction sites. And arguably the most consequential for you all is the newest provision requiring the RME's employer to submit to the state licensing board, quote, detailed information regarding the RME's duties and responsibilities. It's unclear currently what that detailed information exactly must include, but the statute does give some guidance that says the statement regarding the RME's supervision and control of construction operations, including managing, supervision, or labor on a daily basis. How has the RME participated in the construction activities or the RFI process or the change order process? I would like to note, failure to abide by this statutory update can result in a misdemeanor of up to 6 months in jail and $3,000 to $5,000 in fines. Next up are contractor updates, and specifically the contractor updates pertain to payroll monitoring and reporting. Senate Bill 727 amended Labor Code 218.8 to include a new process for direct contractors for contracts entered into on or after January 1st, 2022. In circumstances where the direct contractor fails to meet payroll and monitoring requirements, as I'll discuss in a second, there are new penalties for direct contractors. Those new penalties have been expanded to include penalties, which are undefined, liquidated damages, and interest owed by the subcontractor on account of performance of the labor. These are remedies in addition to what was previously allowed, including unpaid wages, fringe benefits, and other benefits. And these penalties can be incurred either through a complaint filed by the harmed third party or the Labor Commission. Now, under the new law, direct contractors are also required to, quote, monitor subcontractors' wage and fringe benefits. And once the direct contractor becomes aware, a direct contractor then must take diligent steps and actions to rectify the failure. Prior to making its final payment, the direct contractor must obtain a signed affidavit that the subcontractor has paid wages and benefits, and the direct contractor may withhold disputed amounts if the subcontractor does not provide the information requested. As a practical step for contractors, there's a provision in 2018.8 E and F that allows you to, or requires you to include contractual language as a direct contractor with your subs for specific documents that you must request from your subcontractors. And as an additional step, direct contractors should require their subcontractors to include language in their second and third tier subcontracts in order to get that information and maintain the monitoring requirements. Last but not least, the expanded reporting requirements through AB 1023, and this pertains specifically to public works of improvement contracts. Contractors and subs must furnish accurate certified payroll records at least once every 30 days while work is being performed, and they must provide the same records within 30 days of project completion. And they must be uploaded in electronic format to the Department of Labor's website. California has a specific website. I'm happy to share that with you. I have 1 minute left. Thank you all for listening to me. Cool, I got you, Heather.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. We are on a pretty tight timeline. I am informed that people may want to consider driving over to Pebble Beach, given the kind of the short time frame we have here. For people who are going wine tasting, 11 o'clock in the lobby, and we'll see you all here at dinner tonight. Thank you very much.